Hey everybody, welcome back. For those of you who are new here, this is Cooking with Kimberly. For those of you who are returning, thank you very much. Today I am making pizza. I'm making pizza from scratch. While we do live off-grid and we do try to eat as healthy as possible, Fridays has been pizza day for as long as we've been together. So Fridays has always been a little bit of a cheat day. As we've kind of moved into a more sustainable lifestyle, we've started to look at some of our food choices. Pizza is not necessarily the healthiest thing on the planet, but it does help a little bit when you're making your own dough from scratch. So we don't buy pizza anymore. That and you know, it's not like skip the dishes is right around the corner. We don't buy pizza anymore. Instead, I will make pizza. So while I do at this point use ingredients that are from the store with tomato sauce and whatever ingredients I'm putting on the pizza, we make our own dough, or I should say I make our own dough from scratch. So it's actually pretty simple. It involves just a few things in terms of ingredients. So I like to substitute things as much as I can with healthier alternatives. This particular pizza recipe calls for all-purpose flour, but you can use rye flour in certain ones. So I went looking for another recipe that I could find that would use at least partially rye flour, and I've started to substitute in more of the rye flour for all-purpose flour. So those are two of the ingredients that you'll need with your pizza dough. If you choose to make it with all-purpose, that's fine. For us, we choose to do, I can get away with usually about 60-40, so 60% rye and then 40% all-purpose, but that's definitely ingredients that you'll need. You'll also need salt, just a little bit. That's for your first step. Your second step of your process for making your dough, you'll need yeast and brown sugar. I know this, who thought brown sugar was in pizza dough? Yeast and brown sugar, and then for the last part of it, you will need olive oil. Now, I don't tend to cook with olive oil a whole lot. Mom told me it's not very healthy to cook with olive oil. However, in this recipe, there are only 2 tablespoons, so it's not too bad. And usually, the only other thing I'll use olive oil for is salad dressing. So it's not like it's something that we do eat or cook or bake with on a regular basis. That's it for your ingredients. As well, you'll need water. Warm water, of course, but that's from the kitchen tap behind me here. In terms of your bowls and your utensils, things that you will need a bigger bowl. This is where everything is going to go in terms of your larger bowl, so that you've got all your ingredients in here. This is where your dough will end up being. You'll also need a bowl, a smaller bowl. It doesn't have to be this type. It can be any type. I just grabbed a bowl out of the cupboard. There, so you'll need a smaller bowl just for mixing smaller things together. You will need, I tend not to use measurements and measuring spoons and stuff, but you will need a cup measurement, as well as, if you so choose, a half cup measurement. I like to make sure that I'm pretty exact with my water. And then you will need as well a teaspoon measurement and a tablespoon measurement. Teaspoon I can do with my hand, but tablespoon not really. So that's something that I like to make sure that I have all my utensils for. Just to make sure that I'm exact with things, and if I need to add a little bit more as I go, then that's fine, but at least I know I have the minimum that's required. That's it. I'm going to go ahead and wash my hands and get started. With pizza dough, one thing you have to remember is that you're going to be kneading your dough a lot. So again, like when you're always in the kitchen, you want to make sure that you wash your hands beforehand. But I always tend to do a little bit extra just because I know that I'm going to be touching the pizza dough and all that stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and wash my hands and we'll get started. So the recipe that I'm going to link in the description down below is the recipe that I'm currently using. However, I'm going to show you a way to kind of save yourself some time and what I do first. So first things first, I'm going to take my smaller bowl. In the recipe, this is the second step, but I like to do it first because that way I can sit with the yeast rising while I'm dealing with my dry ingredients. So I take my bowl. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my half cup measurement, and you want this much water in your bowl. So this is a half cup. You're gonna want a half cup, and I should specify that it needs to be warm water just because you're putting yeast into it. And yeast, as those of you who bake or cook know, yeast does not rise if it's not warm water. So you don't want hot, but you don't want cold. You want it to be warm, just comfortable. Like do a pinky test, just comfortable. In terms of how much yeast you're putting in here, the recipe that I'm following calls for 0.25 or a quarter of a dry yeast packet. However, what that equates out to is 3 teaspoons. So you're gonna do 3 teaspoons of yeast, and you don't just wanna dump it all in one spot. You kind of wanna stir it around a little bit, or sprinkle it around a little bit so that you can stir it around. You don't want it to completely dissolve right now. That's going to be over the next 10 minutes. Once you have your yeast in your bowl, what you're going to do, and I'm just breaking up this brown sugar a little bit here, what you're going to do is break it up, and then you're going to add about, it says 1 teaspoon. I'm just going to use my tablespoon measurement, so I'm going to want about 1/3 of that to be full. And you're just going to put your brown sugar in here and just let it dissolve. You can stir it if you like. I just kind of let it sit there. It all dissolves within your water. So that's your yeast and brown sugar mixture. It's gonna sit for about 10 minutes and then it will have risen. This way I can focus on my dry ingredients because that's the second part of my step done. So what happens at this point is you're going to need your sugar and your your salt and your 2 types of flour. So what I've done is I've put a teaspoon of salt already in this bowl. I've just kind of measured that out by hand. So you have a teaspoon of salt, and now for your flour. So in terms of your flour, this recipe calls for 4.5 cups of flour in total, or I'm sorry, 3.5 cups of flour in total. So it calls for 2.5 cups of your all-purpose and 1 cup of rye. What I tend to do, instead of doing 3.5 cups, I'll go closer to 4 cups. And I'll do 2 and 2, which works out really well, and it's a nice substitute because we don't have quite as much all-purpose. So I'll do 2 all-purpose cups of flour and 2 rye cups of flour. Now you can play around to see what works for you. You can kind of play with the measurements and see if you like it with more of a rye flavor, or more of a white pizza flavor. I will warn you that with rye, your pizza dough will not rise as much. So you will have a thinner crust and you'll have a flatter crust, and it will taste like more of a rye pizza crust. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and put my 4 cups of flour into my bowl, 2 of each. I'm going to leave my rye flour out here just because I am going to need it when I'm kneading my dough. So these are your dry ingredients, and you're just going to wait for about 10 minutes. It's been about 5 or so already, so I'm just going to wait for it to rise with my yeast and my brown sugar mixture. Once that's done, I will then pour that in here, and I'll get started with my 3rd step. All right, so I've let my yeast and brown sugar mixture sit for about 10 minutes. You can see by the picture on the screen right now that that is what it is supposed to look like after about 10 minutes. You just want the yeast to react with the water. Again, why it's important for the water to be warm. Once that's done, once you've let it sit for about 10 minutes, you're going to just mix it in with your flour mixture. And at this point, you just want to dump it in. Now your next step, for your 3rd step, is something that's rather quick. What you're wanting to do is take your remaining cup of water, so I'm going to do 2 of these. Again, you want it to be warm water, and I'm going to put 2 tablespoons of olive oil in with my bowl and just mix it up together. So I've got my 2 tablespoons of olive oil that have been put in here. I'm just going to mix it all up. I like to use the same bowl that I used for the yeast and the brown sugar mixture, just because it gets all of the final little pieces out of my bowl. Once that's well and mixed, obviously oil and water are not ideal to go together, but once it's well and mixed, you're gonna just put it in your bowl with everything. Now what you want to do is grab some sort of large mixing spoon, which is exactly what I'll do, and just mix it up, just because you're going to need to actually mix the dough rather than just let it sit as a pile of water, which is what it looks like right now in my bowl here. So I ended up grabbing one of our bamboo spoons as well as a stainless steel just because the dough is at this point rather sticky. So this is what it will look like when you finish mixing it all up. Obviously that's not quite in the collective sense of dough that we need. So what I do at this point is add a mix of flour and water just until I can knead it properly. So that's what I'm going to go ahead and do, and then I will show you guys the next step. Kneading is done. This is what you will end up with, a ball of dough. Now what you need to do is let it sit to rise. It won't, depending on how much rye you've put in it, how much rye flour you've put in it, it won't rise to the point of needing to overexpand the bowl. I did end up switching the bowl halfway through. I usually do that. And an added sort of ingredient that I used was coconut oil just to grease the bowl. The reason that I do that is because if the dough is a little bit too sticky, it can be very, very messy once you've let it sit for an hour or so. So once you've mixed up your dough and you have your dough kneaded and all the rest of that stuff, I would advise grabbing a tea towel and placing it over top of your bowl, your greased bowl, just to make sure that it doesn't harden or get too soft either. So you want to make sure you maintain the same temperature. And I usually just put it in our gas stove, which is not on, but it just is out of the way, and it can sit in a dark environment, and it usually needs to sit for about an hour. I did end up adding a little bit of extra flour and a little bit of extra water. I'd say probably an extra quarter cup of rye, an extra quarter cup of all-purpose, and then maybe an extra half cup or so of water. That is dependent on how the dough looks. I really can't tell you exact measurements in terms of what you should do. You just want to make sure that the spoon sticks upright in your dough, and at that point it's ready to be kneaded. And you kind of add more flour or more water as necessary. If your dough is too sticky, you're going to want to add more flour, and if it is too falling apart or too dry, then you're obviously going to want to add more water. So that's something that comes with experience. And I got into some very messy situations when I first made this pizza dough, or the first couple times I made this pizza dough, in terms of not understanding when to add water or when to add flour. So try that out. Let me know how it goes in the comments below. But what I'm going to do is put a tea towel over this, stick it in our stove, and let it sit for about an hour, and then I'll show you guys the next part of the process. All right, so I have let the dough sit. You can see from how it is, actually this turned out really, really well. It's a little bit sticky at the bottom, or a little bit moist, I should say. For those of you that hate that word, I apologize. It's a little bit moist on the bottom, but it works out really well. So what you can do now is you have a couple options. What we have done in the past is we have just rolled it out like this and had the crust be like so. This does provide a rather thick crust, although because it's about 60% rye, it's not going to rise as much, or 50%, whatever you want to say for that. So because of the fact that it's more rye, it's not going to rise as much. So what we usually do is we split it in half. What we've taken to doing over the past couple weeks has been to split the dough in half and roll them out into two separate pizza crusts. Now that makes for a very thin pizza crust, but it's not necessarily a bad thing, because once it's a thin pizza crust, then it doesn't, you have double the pizza because you have two pizzas, which works really well. So what I usually do at this point is I'll just put them here. What we've taken to doing again is rolling them out on here so that we know the exact size, and I just make sure that they're even. Now normally at this point I will roll them out, however I've been having some problems with my wrist lately. Yeah, I know, jokes in the comments. I've been having some problems with my wrist lately, so Andre is actually going to come and roll them out for me, and he needs a rolling pin, so that will be that. He's going to roll them out, I'm going to build the fire, and then we're just going to decorate our pizzas and make our pizzas, and that's going to be that. The fire is going, the pizzas are made. You can see that I ended up having to take a little bit longer with the fire there. So Andre actually ended up putting the tomato sauce, as well as the cheese, the ham, and the pineapple on the pizza, which doesn't take too long. That's a pretty simple process. You're just cutting up ingredients and putting them on there. But you can see the process for the dough. That was the biggest part of making the pizza. And it's not too difficult. It's a pretty simple process, just takes some time and some practice. So these are the pizzas. I usually put them in our oven for about, I would say about an hour, between 350 and 400, just depending on how hot the oven gets. But it's gonna look approximately the same. It's just that the dough itself is gonna be cooked. So thank you so much for tuning in, guys. Appreciate the views. Thank you so much for watching. Leave a comment in the comments down below if you have any suggestions for different types of pizzas that I can try, or if you've tried this recipe and you tried the dough and the crust and it turned out all right for you. Let me know in the comments. Make sure you leave a like if you've not already, and subscribe so you don't miss our next videos. And I'll see you in the next one. I'm about to start talking again, so I don't know if you're...
Blah, 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 blah.